They told her she was too small, too uneducated, too insignificant to ever understand the world of power and money. "Don't bother explaining," one executive sneered. "She won't get it." But what no one realized was that this black, single mom had been quietly studying every rule, every flaw, every loophole they thought was hidden. And when the moment came, she didn't just prove them wrong. She turned their arrogance into her weapon. The very loophole they mocked her for overlooking became the key to an $80 million reversal that shook their empire to the ground. What started as an insult became the spark of the most shocking victory they never saw coming. The morning light crept reluctantly into the narrow apartment, slipping through blinds that had long since lost their shine. The space was modest, too. Modest for the dreams it carried within its walls, yet alive with the rhythm of survival. A small table cluttered with overdue bills stood guard in the corner, their edges curling like tired leaves. Beside them rested a school backpack patched 3 times over, ready for another day of lessons that seemed brighter than the dim world it was born from. At the center of it all was her, a single mother whose name was whispered with both admiration and pity in the neighborhood. She carried herself with quiet strength, though her shoulders often ached from the invisible weight she bore. Her mornings were a choreography of sacrifice, packing lunches with careful precision, stretching groceries to last longer than they should, braiding her child's hair with tender patience, even as her own was tied back in a rushed knot. Life had never asked her permission to be cruel, but it had demanded her endurance. And endure she did. What others dismissed as weakness, she converted into resilience. Where others saw exhaustion, she forged resourcefulness. Yet the world outside rarely noticed. To them, she was another face in the line of women who worked twice as hard for half the credit. The city itself reflected that indifference. Glass towers rose arrogantly against the skyline, their mirrored windows gleaming with wealth. Inside, polished shoes clicked against marble floors while expensive. Watches tracked the passing of hours that always seemed to favor the privileged. In those spaces of power, her existence was invisible. If she was noticed at all, it was with condescension. She had once worked as a low-level assistant in one of those very towers, juggling paperwork and coffee runs with the grace of someone who couldn't afford to fail. Day after day, she'd watch executives glide past her, wrapped in confidence that seemed as natural to them as breathing. They spoke in codes of contracts, mergers, and tax shields, words that formed barriers as strong as walls. She listened, quietly absorbing what they never thought she could understand. Her silence became her education. While they dismissed her as incapable of comprehension, she was learning. Numbers, loopholes, regulatory blind spots, she stored, it all in memory, like a thief preparing for the night when the vault would finally open. It was not malice that drove her, but necessity. Each fact, each pattern, was another weapon against the crushing inevitability of poverty. Still, necessity alone did not guarantee opportunity. She had her share of doors slammed in her face, applications ignored, interviews cut short, recommendations overlooked. The unspoken biases stung the sharpest. She was judged not for her mind, but for her circumstances. A black single mother from a neighborhood most executives drove through with locked doors and windows rolled up. They assumed she would never rise, so they never looked closely enough to see her climbing. The breaking point came on an afternoon that began like all the others. She had been summoned into a boardroom to take notes during a high-level strategy meeting. The table was long, polished to perfection, lined with men and women who spoke in tones that mixed arrogance with boredom. They discussed figures that would make her rent disappear for decades. Millions tossed about like scraps, billions considered with casual disdain. It was during that meeting that the infamous remark was made. One of the executives, irritated by a junior colleague's attempt to clarify a complex contract, waved dismissively toward her. "Don't bother explaining," he sneered. "She won't get it." The words echoed, sharp and humiliating, as the room chuckled politely. They did not see her flinch, She had trained herself too well to mask pain. But deep inside, something shifted. She realized, in that very moment, that the greatest weapon of those in power was their arrogance. They had convinced themselves she was incapable, and that blindness would become her advantage. She returned home that evening more determined than ever. She sat at her small kitchen table, bills spread before her like a battlefield. Her child slept soundly in the next room, dreams unburdened by the weight she carried. In the quiet hours of the night, she pored over the documents she had copied in her memory, tracing lines of contracts she'd overheard, piecing together structures that even the privileged often misunderstood. She wasn't chasing vengeance. She was searching for survival. But survival, she would soon discover, could look a lot like victory. Her life in the months that followed was a blend of exhaustion and obsession. By day, she worked tirelessly to keep food on the table, scrubbing floors, juggling part-time shifts, and stretching every dollar until it threatened to tear. By night, she transformed into a student of the system. She read discarded legal manuals left in office dumpsters, borrowed financial guides from the public library, and listened to online lectures no one expected her to find. The patterns emerged, slowly, like stars revealing themselves at dusk. She began to see not just the rules, but the gaps between them, the spaces where oversight faltered, where arrogance assumed no one would notice. And in those gaps lay the loopholes. One loophole, in particular, stood out gleaming like a hidden key. It was buried within a complex financial structure designed to shield millions in corporate taxes. Executives spoke of it in passing, assuming it was invisible to anyone outside their circle. But she understood. She saw how, with the right timing and precision, it could unlock wealth they had guarded for themselves. Wealth that, by all rights, could belong to someone clever enough to claim it. Her heart raced at the possibility. It wasn't just about money, though the idea of $80 million was a dream so distant it felt unreal. It was about dignity. It was about proving, if only to herself, that their dismissal had been the greatest mistake they ever made. Still, the risk was enormous. One wrong move could bring ruin, not just upon her, but upon the small life she had built for her child. She could not afford to stumble, not when the stakes were so high. So she waited, quietly, patiently, until the day came when the arrogance of the powerful would open the door wide enough for her to step through. That day was approaching. She could feel it in the way conversations shifted in the boardroom, in the urgency that laced the executives' discussions. They were moving money, shuffling assets, restructuring entities, all with the same dismissive confidence that had always blinded them. They never saw her watching. They never imagined she could understand, and as they laughed, as they mocked, as they waved her away with the same words, "She won't get it," she smiled inwardly. For she not only got it, she was about to use it. The pieces of the game were in place. The world still saw her as powerless, struggling, insignificant. But within her grasp lay the key to an $80 million reversal. All she needed was the moment to strike. The days that followed carried a weight unlike any she had known before. Each step of her routine, cooking, cleaning, caring for her child, seemed laced with an invisible current, the pull of something monumental just beyond the horizon. She carried her secret like a fragile flame cupped in her hands, both terrified it might extinguish and terrified of what might happen if it roared into full fire. Her notebook became her lifeline. She scribbled in it by candlelight, long after the city outside had gone to sleep. The pages were filled with diagrams of corporate structures, arrows and circles mapping the flow of money like a general sketching plans for battle. Every note was a translation of the language she had overheard but never been invited to learn. Each line drawn was an act of rebellion against the voices that told her she wasn't capable of understanding. It wasn't enough to see the loophole. She had to understand it so completely that no one could take it from her. She tracked the companies, followed their filings, and studied the subtle differences between what they declared publicly and what was hidden in the fine print. The deeper she looked, the clearer it became. The empire that mocked her had built itself on foundations riddled with cracks, and arrogance had made them careless. The executives carried themselves like emperors who believed their kingdom untouchable. They hosted lavish dinners where contracts were toasted over glasses of champagne worth more than her month's rent. They whispered about sheltering millions and structuring exemptions, their words dipped in entitlement. To them, money wasn't survival, it was sport. They bent rules, confident no one would ever dare question them. She was invisible in their world, a ghost they never thought to fear. That invisibility became her shield. She gathered scraps of information left carelessly in plain sight, half-shredded memos tossed in bins, conversations overheard in elevators, discarded drafts of contracts left on printers. What they considered trash became her arsenal. But with knowledge came fear. The closer she drew to the truth, the more dangerous it became. If anyone suspected what she was piecing together, they could crush her with the weight of their power. She had seen how swiftly they silenced those who opposed them. Careers destroyed, reputations ruined, lawsuits filed with the precision of a blade. There were nights when she considered abandoning the plan. Nights when exhaustion pressed so heavily on her chest that she thought of simply surviving one more day, one more week, one more year. But then she would glance at her child's sleeping form, curled beneath a threadbare blanket, and remember why she couldn't stop. This wasn't just about her. It was about breaking a cycle of dismissal, about proving that the underestimated could rewrite the rules. The first test of her resolve came in the form of an audit. The company, bloated with pride, had triggered the scrutiny of regulators. She wasn't in the room where the panic spread, but she felt the ripple effects. Meetings became more frequent, papers piled higher, voices grew sharper. She knew then that the loophole she had discovered was no theoretical concept. It was the very one they were scrambling to hide. Her pulse quickened. If the regulators missed it, she could exploit it. But if they found it first, the opportunity would vanish forever. She doubled her efforts. Each evening, she sifted through public records, tracing shell companies and subsidiaries like a detective, piecing together a mystery. The numbers didn't just tell a story. They told the story of greed, carefully disguised as strategy. Buried in those ledgers was proof that millions were being diverted, sheltered, concealed. And buried deeper still was the pathway for her to turn their weapon back on them. Yet time was slipping. The audit's deadline loomed, and so did her rent. Food was running thin. The stress pressed against her ribs like iron bars. Every sound seemed amplified. The creak of the apartment floorboards, the ticking of the clock, the sigh of wind through cracked windows. She was building something fragile in a world eager to shatter it. The executives, oblivious to her quiet storm, carried on in their disdain. At one particularly heated meeting, as she cleared away empty coffee cups, she overheard them boasting about how regulators never looked hard enough, and how ordinary people couldn't even begin to grasp the sophistication of their structures. The laughter that followed was like salt in an open wound. She won't get it. The phrase had become their mantra, their blindfold. They didn't notice the way her eyes lingered on the papers they left behind. They didn't see the way she studied the flow of transactions highlighted in yellow marker. They never imagined that the woman they dismissed could decode the language they used to keep others out. What none of them realized was that she was no longer just decoding, she was planning. She began constructing a strategy as meticulous as the one she had once used to stretch $1 into 3 meals. Step by step, she mapped how the loophole could be legally activated, how the structure they relied upon could collapse under its own contradictions. The brilliance of it was that it didn't require her to create anything new. She only had to use what they had already built, and what they had built was flawed. Every night, she refined the plan, testing scenarios in her notebook, cross-checking figures, rehearsing in silence until her hand cramped. She worked until her vision blurred, then rose again the next day to face the grind of survival. The duality of her existence, struggling single mother by day, silent strategist by night, became her reality. The tension escalated when whispers of a potential acquisition surfaced. The executives were preparing to announce a major deal, one that relied on the very loophole she had uncovered. If the deal went through, they would secure billions, while she and countless others remained invisible. But if she moved at the right moment, the loophole could backfire with catastrophic precision. The timing had to be perfect. Too early, and she risked exposure without results. Too late, and the deal would cement their power beyond reach. Every instinct screamed that the window was closing. In those final weeks, her body bore the toll of her double life. Her eyes burned from sleepless nights. Her hands trembled with fatigue. Her heart raced with equal parts fear and anticipation. Yet her spirit remained unbroken. She had carried burdens heavier than exhaustion, endured wounds deeper than fear. And now, the thought of $80 million, a figure so vast it could rewrite her future, was no longer a dream. It was a destination. The world around her seemed to shrink into focus. The noise of daily struggles dulled beneath the roar of the plan taking shape. Each insult she had endured, each door slammed in her face, each time she had been overlooked. All of it condensed into the singular moment she was preparing to unleash, the rising tide of tension built toward inevitability. The deal was set to be announced at a grand shareholders' meeting, the kind of event where suits gleamed under stage lights and arrogance was displayed like jewelry. The executives would celebrate their genius, certain of their untouchable status. But behind the scenes a storm was waiting. She was ready, her plan sharp as a blade honed in silence. They had laughed at her, mocked her, dismissed her. They believed she wouldn't get it. They were about to discover just how wrong they were. The day of the shareholder meeting dawned with a brilliance the city rarely saw. The sky stretched wide and unbroken, sunlight flashing against the glass towers as if to announce that something extraordinary was about to unfold. Inside one of those towers, the grand conference hall gleamed with excess, chandeliers dripping with crystal, velvet chairs aligned in perfect rows, and a stage set with screens that would broadcast every word to the world of finance. The executives strutted across the stage as though it were a coronation. Their tailored suits shimmered under the spotlights, their rehearsed smiles sharp with pride. They had waited months for this moment, the unveiling of their brilliant acquisition deal. It was the culmination of their schemes, the pinnacle of their arrogance. They whispered among themselves about the millions they would secure, the applause they would receive, the headlines they would dominate. Not once did they consider the quiet woman who had slipped into the crowd, blending with the sea of attendees. She wore no jewelry, no polished veneer of wealth, only the calm resolve of someone who had endured storms far greater than stage lights and smug speeches. She sat near the back, notebook hidden in her bag, her heart beating a rhythm that seemed to echo the ticking countdown to destiny. The presentation began with predictable theatrics. Graphs rose upward on the massive screens. Numbers glowed in golden fonts, and words like innovation, expansion, and vision filled the air. The executives spoke with practiced eloquence, their voices dripping with certainty. They laughed at their own jokes, gestured grandly, basked in the admiration of the audience, and then the floor opened for questions. This was the moment she had waited for. She stood slowly, her presence almost too quiet for the room at first. Heads turned, some curious, some impatient. The executives barely concealed their irritation. To them, she was nothing more than a distraction, a nuisance delaying their applause. But then she began to speak. Her voice was steady, measured, carrying the kind of weight born not of privilege but of conviction. She spoke of the acquisition deal, reciting details with precision that made heads tilt in surprise. She pointed out discrepancies in the structure, gaps in the reporting, contradictions hidden in the fine print. What began as murmurs of curiosity spread into waves of confusion as shareholders leaned forward, straining to catch every word. On stage, the executives shifted uncomfortably. Their smiles faltered. Their carefully rehearsed performance cracked under the light of her scrutiny. And then came the strike. She unveiled the loophole, the very flaw they had built their empire upon. With undeniable clarity, she exposed how their deal relied on a tax shelter so fragile, so recklessly constructed, that it not only violated ethical standards, but risked collapsing entirely under regulatory pressure. She didn't just hint. She presented. She named subsidiaries, cited figures, and laid out the trail like stepping stones no one could ignore. Gasps rippled through the hall. Shareholders turned to one another, eyes wide with shock. Journalists scribbled furiously. Cameras zoomed in, microphones angled toward her. The words she had carried in silence for months now thundered through the most powerful room in the city, and there, in the midst of it all, she repeated the words once used to dismiss her. "Don't bother explaining, she won't get it." Phrase hung in the air like a blade, cutting through the arrogance that had defined them. Gasps gave way to silence so sharp it pressed against the skin. Everyone understood the weight of the reversal. She hadn't just gotten it. She had mastered it, weaponized it, and turned it into an 80 million reckoning. The executives stood frozen, their faces pale under the spotlights. Their empire, their pride, their sense of superiority, all unraveling before their eyes. The shareholders who had once cheered them now glared with suspicion. Questions flew like arrows, not at her but at them. Their deal, once celebrated, now reeked of fraud and failure. They stammered, attempted to deflect, to explain. But the tide had turned. No amount of jargon or bravado could erase what she had revealed. Their downfall was unfolding in real time, and they were powerless to stop it. For the first time, she wasn't invisible. She wasn't dismissed, ignored, or silenced. Every eye in the hall was on her. Every voice whispered her name. Every camera captured her triumph. She stood not as a struggling single mother desperate for survival, but as the woman who had exposed the arrogance of an empire. The humiliation of the executives was complete. Their laughter, once directed at her, was replaced by stunned silence, and the crumbling of reputations they had thought untouchable. Their empire, once shielded by loopholes, now trembled beneath the weight of its own deceit. And she, the woman they mocked, the mother they underestimated, the one they claimed wouldn't get it, stood as the undeniable victor. Ihor. Echoes of that day did not fade quickly. News spread like wildfire, the headlines almost too dramatic to believe. Single mother exposes $80 million corporate loophole. Her name, once unknown beyond the limits of her neighborhood, was suddenly everywhere. What had begun as a quiet act of survival had become a public reckoning, a seismic shift in a world that had built itself on arrogance. For the executives, the fallout was brutal. Shareholders demanded answers, regulators swarmed in, and reputations that had once seemed untouchable crumbled in the glare of scrutiny. Deals evaporated overnight. Stock prices plummeted. Careers, carefully built on deception and dismissal, ended in disgrace. Some tried to fight, to paint her as unqualified or lucky, but the evidence she had laid bare was undeniable. Their downfall was written not by her words alone, but by their own arrogance, exposed in the light they had once tried to keep her from seeing. For her, the transformation was both immediate and surreal. The very loophole they thought she would never understand had not only shattered their empire, but unlocked opportunities she could barely have imagined. Financial rewards followed, not stolen, not begged for, but earned through intelligence, persistence, and courage. The $80 million figure that had once sounded like an abstract dream now stood as proof that power did not always belong to those who mocked the loudest. Yet the true victory wasn't in the money. It was in the dignity reclaimed. For years, she had been dismissed as incapable, invisible in the rooms where decisions shaped lives. Now those same rooms could no longer ignore her. She was invited to speak, to consult, to advise. She was proof that brilliance could exist in the very places arrogance refused to look. Her child, once shielded from the weight of struggle, now grew up in a world transformed by her determination. No longer did the sound of overdue notices or the ache of uncertainty shadow their nights. Instead, there was stability, opportunity, and the quiet assurance that their future would not be dictated by the cruelty of others. But she never let the world forget the journey. She didn't trade her humility for the wealth she had gained. Instead, she used her platform to tell the story, not of luck, but of perseverance, not of privilege, but of resilience. She spoke to others who had been silenced, reminding them that knowledge was power, and that underestimation could be turned into strength. Her victory became a lesson, not just for her community, but for anyone who had ever been told they weren't enough. She proved that brilliance is not determined by circumstance, and that survival, when coupled with courage, can rise into triumph. The executive's phrase, "Don't bother explaining, she won't get it," followed them like a curse. What had once been their sneer became the headline of their downfall, repeated endlessly as a reminder of their arrogance. And for her, those words no longer carried pain, only power. They had been the spark that lit the fire of her resolve, the insult that paved the road to her vindication. In the quiet moments that followed the storm, she sometimes stood at the window of her new home, looking out at the same skyline that once seemed untouchable. The towers still gleamed, the city still pulsed with the rhythm of wealth and ambition. But now she understood something deeper. Power does not always belong to those who claim it the loudest. Sometimes it belongs to the ones who endure, who learn in silence, who rise when no one believes they can. Her story did not end with the loophole, it began there. She built foundations not of arrogance, but of purpose. She invested in education, opened doors for others who had been told they wouldn't get it, and turned her triumph into a legacy that reached far beyond herself. And so, the impact stretched wider than $80 million. It rippled through boardrooms that learned the cost of underestimation. It echoed in communities that found hope in her resilience. It whispered into the ears of every doubter, every skeptic, every voice that dared to dismiss another. Be careful whom you overlook. For the world had seen it now. The woman they mocked had not only gotten it, she had gotten everything.